Newton's model of gravity does not respect this. Newton's model of gravity doesn't have anything to do with time in it. Newton's model of gravity is an action at a distance, an instantaneous action at a distance. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is, suppose that you've got the sun here, and we've got the Earth going around the sun. Okay, and according to Newtonian gravity, the Earth exerts a force on the sun, and vice versa. And the force that the Earth exerts on the sun is precisely that centric or centripetal force required for the Earth to be in circular motion. Okay, that's Newton's model of gravity. Okay, now the problem is the force, according to Newton, the force the sun exerts on the Earth depends upon the instantaneous positions of these two cars. Okay, at the same instant. Okay, now remember relativity of simultaneity. When you say that these two events are happening simultaneously, well, simultaneous for who? Okay, so right away there's going to be a bit of a problem. You can see, but a simpler way to see that is, let's suppose that at one instant of time, the sun suddenly disappears. So we're a magician, and we can make the sun magically disappear. Okay, so at some specific, so here's the Earth wheeling around this orbit here, and at this particular instant of time, when it's at this position, we suddenly remove the sun. What's going to happen, according to Newton's model of gravity, to the trajectory of the Earth? Sorry, the instant that we remove the sun, according to Newton's model of gravity, the gravitational force is instantly gone, because the gravitational force is g times m, the two masses divided by r squared. There's no issue of time here. Okay, this r here is the instantaneous distance, etc. Okay, as soon as we pull this guy out, this force disappears. No more center-directed force, just like the apple in the space station, bang, it takes off on its trajectory. And we would know instantly that has happened.
As I began to contemplate composing this paper, I had a long conversation with a distinguished New York antiquarian bookseller. Why, I asked him, do people collect autographed literary manuscripts? Without hesitating, he responded, to make a lot of money. But this, of course, begs the real question. Why do collectors offer large sums to possess autographs of manuscripts and original typescripts of famous writers, composers, historians, and scientists? If, for example, someone in England should find in a hidden drawer of an antique desk an autographed manuscript of Shakespeare's Hamlet, why would it be of inestimable value? The response, I believe, would be trifold. First, an autograph of a literary manuscript is a secular relic, like a bona fide fragment from St. Thomas's skull or the Shroud of Turin. Such an object, were it to be veritable, would tangibly link us to a personage of the past. The desire to feel physically close to our literary forebears is human and natural, shared by the most humble and the most erudite. A second and more substantive reason is that an autograph guarantees the authenticity of a composition and implicitly of a special textual tradition. Thus, codices spuriously attributed to the hand of Augustine, Jerome, and Ambrose were both regarded as relics of the saints and characters of the authorship of celebrated and venerated patristic works. Important as the aforementioned roles of the autographed manuscript are, and have been from medieval times onward, another and most important role of the autograph is to give insight into the authorial process. Since at least the 19th century, students of literary history have searched for and carefully preserved manuscripts that record by erasure, marginal, and interlineal annotations, notes de renvoi, arrows, and light marks, the creative process by which a first draft evolves into a memorable and fully confected masterpiece. It is important when we turn to antiquity, the Middle Ages, and the early Renaissance to realize that autographs of this character that provide such insight into the creative process are either entirely absent or scarcely present. The autograph attributed falsely to Virgil is a telegraphic manuscript. Equally telegraphic are the codices spuriously attributed to the late antique church fathers like Augustine. The illuminations and paintings of the Middle Ages and Renaissance that show Cicero, Augustine, Ambrose writing their compositions are in fact anachronistic. The Greeks and Romans, and here I differ somewhat with the previous speaker, generally composed in dictation to secretaries, who took down their words in syllabic shorthand, either on wax tablets or on parchment notebooks. The antecedents of the medieval codex that before the 3rd century were used primarily for provisional notes and not for a compacted text, for which the appropriate medium would have been the laterally extending scroll. Rare indeed were figures like Ambrose, who are known and wrote about and who acknowledged through writing their own letters and tracts. As I have explained elsewhere, the ancient culture of belles lettres was largely an oral one, in which the process of composition, like that of reading, was habitually vocal. The attraction of the classical world of letters with its division of labor between authors, secretaries, and professional readers within the confines of monastic communities, such as Cassiodorus' retreat at Bavaria, undoubtedly brought authors into more intimate contact with the books that contained their texts, which by this date were almost exclusively in codex form. Cassiodorus was concerned with text formats that would simplify reading, such as the lines of sense, for coleg commata, espoused by Jerome, to aid simple prayers, punctuation, and perhaps even the insistent aeration characteristic of certain late antique Christian codices written in scriptura continuous writing. But we must remember all this, like at the time of the ancients and in the Roman Empire, and for the whole period of Greek antiquity, there were no spaces between words, and virtually no punctuation. Elsewhere, I set forth the general thesis that the full word federation that came to characterize all NCO Latin script in the late 8th century permitted the evolution of silent reading. Logically, this new script that enabled the silent and entirely visual decoding of text would have fostered silent autograph composition. However, the use of wax tablets and parchment booklets similar to those employed in late antiquity has left us bereft of any tangible evidence of authorial autograph activity in the British Isles, where at any rate, most surviving Latin books were copies of the Gospels. Johannes Scottish, an Irishman at the court of Charles the Bald in the 9th century, however, left word-separated corrections as additions to the formal scribal transcriptions of his works, which had been copied from prior drafts by continental hand in unseparated script. Word separation, which enhanced the manipulation of written text, was a prerequisite for the modern draft autograph. Authorial codex, that is, text written in formal book script with occasional corrections reasonably attributable to the author, became characteristic of word-separated literary circles from the time of Johannes Scottish to the end of the 10th and into the early 11th century. There are a number of examples, of which the most famous is Reicher's Chronicle of the Franks, which is only one codex in Bamberg, which has some revisions in it. Others include the Jests of the Bishops of Cambrai, which is associated in the 11th century with Gerard of Cambrai, which has authorial thought to be authorial marks in it, a provision. Another with far fewer marks is the reputed authorial codex containing the poem which Alberon of Laon composed for King Robert the Pious. At St. Gall, the earliest major continental center of word separation, Notar Bautilus, the author of liturgical text in the early 10th century, explicitly refers to the notebooks that he used for composing preliminary versions of his works. Notebooks, along with wax tablets, surely continued to serve an important draft function for the authorial creative process. 10th and 11th century examples of such artifacts, however, scarcely survive. Indeed, we only have a single example of a codex which might be deemed a notebook, and only a very few wax tablets, none of which bear witness to autograph composition. However, in literary texts, the increasing practice of composing in written form has left its traces. Guibert de Nogent, at the end of his life, lamented that due to incipient blindness, he could no longer write his text, but was obliged to dictate to a secretary. The case of Guibert is particularly revealing, for although quite clearly somewhat of an eccentric, he felt free in written form to write erotic poems and record disturbing dreams and fantasies, which, it is fair to speculate, he might have been more hesitant to divulge orally to his secretary. Even earlier, Hoffmann de Saint-Amand, active in an early South German center of word separation, expressed his own erotic fantasies within the new medium. Abelard's history of his calamities is a 12th century example of this genre. However, the artifacts that might have documented the documentation, the drafting of such compositions of these works of a highly personal character have all vanished. If the medium of word-separated script enhanced the propensity of authors on occasion to write their own compositions and, more frequently, to correct and modify compositions transcribed by secretaries, the writing materials of the pre-scholastic period and later of the scholastic age were still not conducive to the use of the pen as a primary instrument for composition. Parchment was expensive, which has been made today, and relative both to ancient papyrus and modern paper, a difficult sport on which to write. Wax tablets constituted a more user-friendly alternative for short sections of text, but because of their limited surface, they were clearly incapable of receiving a full draft of an entire opus. It is thus within the demi-oral milieu of scholastic composition characteristic of universities in the Central Middle Ages that the enigmatic vocabulary for the authorial composition of medieval composition must be assessed. Here the term dictare retained its ancient meaning of composing orally a text, although on occasion the verb might also be used to refer to text composed entirely in written form. The verb dictare is in the sense of reading aloud a fully composed text as a means of rapidly producing copies, occurred really only after the year 1400. Dictare was indeed a normal word for literary composition and could refer to either written composition or oral composition. At the same time, the term scribbere was replete with comparable ambiguity. St. Bonaventure, in a famous passage of his preface to his commentary on the sentences of Peter Lombard, enunciated 4 meanings of scribbere that might be, for simplicity, be summarized as 3 separate activities. For Bonaventure, scribbere to write might refer to the activity of copying, that is, of book production, the activity of compiling, that is, of copying and extracting and combining text of works of recognized authors, and implicitly of reordering these works with subdivisions to enhance their clarity, and lastly, the activity of authoring, that is, the expression of the writer's own opinions in what we would term original written composition. Before the late 14th century, the oral dimension of composition was most important those varieties of text that were most distinctly removed from the process of compilatio. The epistle and the sermon were true genres which were usually short works that to a large degree were spontaneously generated viva voce. In contrast, the written dimensions of authorship is most in evidence in the scholastic genres that included compilations of canon law, commentaries of the sentences of Peter Lombard, commentaries on scripture, commentaries on Aristotle, and in their derivatives, the summas of theological thought. Here the process of ordinatio and compilatio were most in evidence, and as Bonaventure's remarks suggest, in such works the tasks of author and of scribe impinged upon each other. In the 14th and 15th centuries, scholastic writers increasingly dissected, segmented, and recombined chunks of prose drawn from both the ancient fathers and 13th century masters. We moderns tend to think of that composing of late scholastic works such as Jean Rousseau's commentary on Aristotle's essays and the copying of a book of hours such as Newberry Library Manuscript 56, The Hours of Marguerite de Foix, were by definition totally different ventures. And yet, viewed in a larger perspective, the process as far as Bonaventure's remarks imply profoundly related. Rousseau, the author, acted as scribe when he derived blocks of sentences from the interior commentaries of Albert Magnus, Thomas Aquinas, and Johannes Berda. His original contribution was chiefly in the nuances of his responses to pre-established questions. That which was unique was a very small percentage of the entire prose content of the tome. Similarly, the scribe of each book of hours was an author, in the sense that he chose and sequenced the devotional prayers that might compose a large portion of his volume. As scribe, compiler, he had the liberty to add nuances by rephrasing the rubrics indicating the modes and uses of prayer. These brief textual elements that constitute a minuscule percentage of the prose content of a book of hours to the modern scholar may be among its most original and significant aspects. In the milieu of the Carthusian convent of the 15th century, the scholastic mode of written composition through a compilation reached its zenith in a world of solitary silence. In the massive opera of Denis the Carthusian that fills over 40 printed volumes, virtually the entire content is a syncretic ordinatio of prose elements drawn from the fathers, earlier scholastic, and liturgy. Three highly significant changes are responsible for the evolution of the autographed manuscript into a document conducive of preserving a record of authorial creativity, the very document that collectors so want to achieve and possess. The first of these was the introduction of paper, beginning in the late 14th century, paper for books as opposed to paper for documents. Paper preempted the use of wax tablets and provided a medium for authorial composition potentially suitable for preservation. 15th century paper codices, particularly those of the Carthusian order, offer us far more tangible examples of the medieval compilatio that survived for the central Middle Ages. In fact, I have the lights in the first slide here. Are you in the lights? How do we get this? Oh, there we go. This is a manuscript of the Newberry Library. It's an autographed compilation of Johannes Hagen, a mid-15th century Carthusian friar who wrote, as was the medieval custom, extracts from the church fathers and composed his own works. And all of this material was bound up together and undoubtedly saved because he was an important personage in the convent of Erfurt. And you can see on the right, this right onto this slip of paper, which you can see on the next slide. It's really a used piece of document, and this context, it just shows how paper became available. And snips of paper were used for this purpose for draft writing, draft compilations, not draft in the creative sense that some of us have been talking about today. Concomitantly with this introduction of paper, a revolution in binding that enabled codices to be shelved vertically accidentally provided the leaves and takedowns, a locus for paper fragments of draft compositions to be preserved. This is another Carthusian manuscript for which the takedowns have what we believe to be autographed notes of another Carthusian friar, Heinrich Kreischer, who is in fact the author of the textual of the bulk of this manuscript. In the earlier Middle Ages, it may be, we're not at all sure, that takedowns of files to a certain degree, they certainly became much more common in the 15th century. So we had two things happening. One, we had paper allowing, giving more material evidence, and two, we have a change in binding and a mammoth effort at rebinding old libraries that meant that many fragments and things that would not have been kept and retained prior to that, to 1400, were retained if only by accident. An additional technique linked to the draft was the development of cursive writing. The friendlier support of paper doubtlessly encouraged writing in which the ductus necessitated minimal liftings of the quill from the page. In contrast to antiquity, when Ambrose regarded writing scriptura continua as a mode of composition slower than dictation, cursive word-separated writing on paper provided a rapid medium, highly suitable for capturing the creative process in situ. The use of cursive writing for the vernacular, which in the course of the 15th century constituted an ever-increasing portion of the handwritten literary pages produced, encouraged the disjunction between written composition and activity of compilatio linked to pouring the Latin corpus of scholastic text, and thereby encouraged a more spontaneous expression of thought in written form. In Latin, the disjunction was encouraged even more by 15th century humanism, with its emphasis on rhetorical eloquence and moral philosophy as opposed to logic, theology, and law. Humanists were drawn to the cursive script as a medium for the expression of the new ideal of discursive written rhetoric. Indeed, the first truly substantial autographed manuscripts revealing the spark of creativity were produced by humanists in Italy in the mid-15th century. A startling example is the extensive draft autograph of George of Trevisan, preserved in the Newberry Library manuscript. And here we have it, and it's like this. You have a cursive writing, an ordinary writing. This is a whole choir added onto a book which he himself copied out in a form of booklet. And here in these smudged portions, you really have writing over erasure. Okay, let's get another idea of this. Here is the beginning of these autographs. This was also his writing as a scribe, his own scribe, writing as a, but this is a second recension which material was added in the margins and when space went into the margins, a whole additional section of text was added in a separate wire. Such draft autographs were rarely preserved. They weren't preserved only because of completing an already existing book. And no comparable informal drafts have yet been discovered for Leonardo Bruni or Marsilio Ficino. But preserved or not, and additional examples may yet be found in 15th century binding, they came to exist in paper and cursive writing combined to form a theater suitable for the creative process to be recorded. Printing provided the final ingredient for the triumph of autograph composition. In the first half of the 15th century, all scholars, including professional humanists, were scribes as well as authors. The distinction between these two functions being arbitrary. They were trained in a hierarchy of scripts. Except for such exceptional cases of the Trebizond Codex, the author was telegraphically in an expert manner recopied his own text and destroyed his way. Heinrich Reicher, his treatise on divine wisdom, bears the inscription that this was a copy that the author had scripted and conscripted. That is, he composed in written form and then he engrossed as in a prepared, bare copy. Even the illumination versus a storefront on a street, etc., we almost take them like bread to fit into the confines of different situations. And we then looked at developing those surfaces geometrically and preparing them for a computer tool so that we could build them using the same technology anywhere. And what I found, and I know that a couple of these companies pioneered using them, the automobile prototypers in California, there are 4 different firms that make automobile prototypes, which are body-formed and interior blocks of foam, which roll around for car shows. They don't actually drive, but they have the skin and the structure and the interior of a car. And the per square foot cost of building one of those for Audi last month was $400 a square foot. So the square foot cost of building one of a kind working cars is basically the same square foot cost of a kind of high-end residential house or a high-end interior. So we use these automobile prototypers to make all the components, and in Sweden we called up the prototypers that work for Volvo and Saab and just sent them files over the internet, and they built the interior of our showroom using these cutting tools. So one of the things that we found, and this is a piece of that interior, is that rather than make a building that looked like a computer rendering, we wanted to use the tool and its artifacting to produce a new kind of materiality. So these ridges that look like kind of corduroy are the artifact of the bit which is used to cut the wood. And we found that we needed to program the paths for this tool so that we could always get our patterning to align. And we started to think about the artifact of the tool is actually a design technique that started to basically sketch what the articulation of these surfaces would be based on the control of this bit. So these bumps that you see that we put on it and those paths, the finished interior, were very much part of the aesthetic and the materiality of the surface. So instead of trying to make a slick, reflective computer image in built form, we're really trying to use the tools to generate new kinds of articulation and even a kind of ornament. And you'll see the last thing I'll show you is a kind of much more developed version of that. This is the kind of my newest obsession, which is a figure called a bleb, and it's all industrial designers. This is the bane of their existence. The problem is when you use these spline curves, whenever you have a curve which has convexity or concavity, when you offset the curve to give it material thickness, the curve intersects itself. So you can see this fold, when offset with this much material thickness, first develops a single intersection like this and this, eventually folds through itself 2 times and generates these geometric problems, basically, of a surface which intersects itself. And all of our software has tools which put these things away and they disappear, but it always screws up the rigor of our surfaces. So a year ago I started turning off this automatic procedure, and we started using these captured spaces as an architectural scale spatial device. So one of the first things we did is we're doing large-scale, I hate to say art objects, but art objects for a Max Protesh who has a gallery in New York, where we're doing additions of lighting fixtures, additions of floor elements, additions of wall dividers, where we'll build 10 variations of a very similar piece. And these are diagrams for a skylight, the first one we're building right now. And we went with single, double, and triple folds and started to be about 10 feet by 11 feet square. And this is a model of the formwork that will cast the plastic on. So you can see the rippling and ridging becomes part of the surface effect. And it has a really strong optical quality on the clear material when we cast it. And here we have to break these geometries into components. So we'll cast first one large piece, and then we'll cast these pieces individually out of 2 components. So we'll build these out of sheets. And the way we subdivide them is really based on the manufacturing technology. This same technique we used for a proposal for a new museum in Chelsea that I did with David Childs and Roger Duffy in Arlington, Maryland. We decided to team up. I'd never done a vertical project, and they're the masters of towers. And we thought it was a good opportunity to apply some of these surface modeling technologies to the design of a curtain wall. So for this project, this is about 30 stories high, and it's right on the Hudson River. We decided to model the building as a